Deep in the Appalachian foothills, Robert Callahan had always known the land, the wildlife, and its rhythms like the back of his hand. A man of the woods, taught by his father to respect the balance between life and death, Robert had never expected that one fall afternoon, the forest would present him with a challenge that would blur the lines between hunter and protector. It was a routine day, spent tracking a wounded buck, when Robert noticed a figure watching him from the shadows. A female bobcat, limping, her body worn from a recent struggle, stepped into the clearing. Her eyes held a silent plea that spoke more clearly than words ever could. But it wasn't just her. Soon, a small cub tumbled from the underbrush, followed by another. And then, in the quiet that followed, the mother did something Robert never could have predicted. She cried out, an unusual sound that felt like a message carried on the wind. What happens when a wild creature seeks human help, not in desperation, but in trust? This is the extraordinary tale of a man and a mother who needed help. A bond formed in the unlikeliest of circumstances, and the kind of choice that would forever change the path of both their lives.
The Appalachian foothills of eastern Kentucky held secrets that most people would never know. Robert Callahan had learned this truth from his father, who had learned it from his father before him. At 53, with weathered hands and lines etched deep around his steel blue eyes, Robert carried those secrets like treasures. The forest doesn't yield its wisdom to just anyone, his father, James Callahan, used to say. You've got to earn its trust, same as you would a neighbor's. Growing up in Pine Hollow, a town of barely 800 souls nestled between rolling hills and dense woodland, Robert had absorbed the lessons of the wild alongside arithmetic and spelling. By age 7, he could identify more animal tracks than he could name state capitals. By 12, he could move through dense underbrush without disturbing a single leaf. His father had been a hunter, but more than that, a student of the natural world. Taking more than you need isn't hunting, son, James had taught him. It's greed, and the forest remembers greed. Those words had stayed with Robert long after his father passed away 10 years ago, felled by a stroke while sitting on his porch, binoculars in hand, watching a family of cardinals at the feeder. Sometimes Robert still found himself turning to ask his father a question about animal behavior or weather patterns, only to remember he was alone with the knowledge they had shared. Robert's modest cabin sat on 40 acres of land that had been in the Callahan family for 4 generations. With its hand-hewn oak beams and river-stone fireplace, it was neither grand nor shabby, just a place that belonged to the landscape as naturally as the white pines and sugar maples that surrounded it. His nearest neighbor lived 3 miles down the gravel road, which suited Robert fine. He made his living as a carpenter in town and as a hunting guide during season, taking wealthy businessmen from Louisville and Cincinnati into the backcountry to find deer and turkey. Though he guided hunts, Robert himself had grown increasingly selective about what he killed. In recent years, he took only what he needed for his own table, a deer or 2 for winter meat, wild turkey for special occasions, rabbit and squirrel when the mood struck him. The freezer in his mudroom held vacuum-sealed packages of venison, carefully labeled and dated. He hadn't bought meat from a store in over 20 years. It was early October when everything changed, that golden time when the maples blazed crimson and the hickories turned the hillsides to sheets of hammered gold. The air carried the first hint of winter's bite each morning, though afternoons still held the memory of summer. Robert had spent the day tracking a wounded buck through Coulter's Ridge, not to hunt it, but to end its suffering. Someone had taken a poor shot, likely one of the weekend warriors from the city who thought hunting was about trophies rather than connection and sustenance. After finding the buck and mercifully ending its pain with a clean shot, field dressing it, and packing the meat to donate to the community food pantry in town, Robert found himself exhausted. Nearly 9 hours of careful tracking had left his muscles aching. Rather than push himself to make it back to the cabin before dark, he decided to rest in Miller's clearing, a favorite spot where an ancient white oak had fallen years ago, creating a natural bench beside a small stream. The clearing had always been a good place to observe wildlife. Something about the configuration of the land, the way the stream curved, how the sunlight dappled through the trees in the late afternoon, the abundance of blackberry bushes at the edges, made it a crossroads for the forest's inhabitants. Robert had seen more rare moments here than anywhere else in these woods. A pair of black bears teaching their cubs to fish, a bobcat stalking a wild turkey, a barred owl swooping silently to catch a field mouse. Robert settled onto the fallen oak, his Remington rifle resting across his knees more from habit than necessity. From his pack, he pulled a thermos of coffee, still warm enough to chase away the growing chill, and a sandwich wrapped in waxed paper, venison with horseradish that he'd smoked himself. The simple meal tasted better here than any restaurant fare ever could. As he ate, he observed the clearing with the patience of a lifetime spent watching. A family of raccoons made their careful way to the stream, washing their paws and whatever treasures they'd found before continuing on their journey. A red fox paused at the edge of the clearing, its rust-colored coat brilliant against the green ferns, before deciding to find another path. Squirrels chattered warnings from the branches above, telling tales of the man sitting quietly below. Robert had nearly finished his coffee when he sensed, rather than saw, another presence. Years in the woods had honed his awareness to a fine edge. Something was watching him from the southern edge of the clearing, where the underbrush grew thicker beneath a stand of young hemlocks. He didn't move suddenly or reach for his rifle. Instead, he slowly returned his thermos to his pack and waited. Minutes passed before he saw the first hint of movement, a slight parting of the ferns, deliberate rather than wind-blown. Then came the flash of tawny fur and the distinctive face of a female bobcat, her tufted ears alert, her yellow-green eyes fixed intently on Robert. Even for someone as experienced as Robert, bobcat sightings were uncommon. The notoriously shy felines avoided human contact, hunting mainly at dawn and dusk. To see one openly watching him in the afternoon light was unusual enough to merit stillness and attention. "Well, hello there," Robert murmured, keeping his voice soft and even. The bobcat didn't startle at his voice. Instead, she took a tentative step into the clearing, and that's when Robert noticed two things simultaneously. She was limping badly, favoring her right hind leg, and her teats were swollen with milk. A nursing mother, injured and vulnerable. Robert's breath caught. His father had taught him that seeing a wounded animal, especially a predator, was a moment that tested a person's character. The wounded were dangerous, desperate, and deserving of respect. The bobcat took another step, then another, her gait uneven but determined. As she came fully into the clearing, the cause of her injury became clear. The fur on her right hind leg was matted with dried blood, and the awkward angle suggested a severe wound. With his hunter's trained eye, Robert recognized the telltale signs of a gunshot wound, likely a .22 caliber from the size of the injury. "Someone shot you, didn't they, girl?" Robert said softly. Anger flashed through him. Bobcats were protected in this county, hunting them prohibited except during specific seasons with proper permits. Even then, killing a nursing mother was not just illegal, but deeply unethical by any hunter's code. The bobcat stopped about 15 feet from where Robert sat, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her eyes and the individual spots in her coat pattern. She made a sound then, not a growl or a hiss, but a chirping call that bobcats used primarily with their young. Robert remained still, scarcely breathing. Something extraordinary was happening, something beyond his decades of experience in these woods. The bobcat called again, then looked back toward the hemlock stand she'd emerged from. A moment later, to Robert's astonishment, a small bobcat kitten, probably about 2 months old, tumbled from the underbrush. The mother called again, and a second kitten appeared, smaller than the first. "Well, I'll be," Robert whispered. The mother bobcat limped back to her kittens, nudging them with her nose, then looked back at Robert. The message couldn't have been clearer if she'd spoken in English. "These are my babies. I'm hurt. I need help." Moving with deliberate slowness, Robert set his rifle aside and reached into his pack for the first aid kit he always carried. The mother bobcat watched him, ears flattened slightly, but not hissing or showing aggression. "I'm going to try to help you," Robert said, keeping his voice steady and calm. "But you're not going to make it easy, are you?" As if in answer, when Robert rose to his feet, the bobcat growled, a low rumble of warning that needed no translation. She positioned herself between Robert and her kittens, her injured leg trembling with the effort of supporting her weight. Robert sank back down onto the log. "All right then, we do this your way." For nearly an hour, they remained in this standoff. Robert occasionally speaking softly, the bobcat watching vigilantly. The kittens, oblivious to the tension, tumbled over each other in play until their mother's sharp chirp would bring them back to her side. As the afternoon light began to fade, painting the clearing in amber and gold, Robert knew he needed to head back. He couldn't treat the bobcat if she wouldn't let him approach, and he couldn't stay in the woods after dark, not with the temperature dropping and without proper gear. "I've got to go now," he told the bobcat, feeling slightly foolish for explaining himself to a wild animal. "But I'll come back tomorrow, right here, with something for that leg." He gathered his things and stood slowly. The bobcat watched him, her eyes never leaving his face. As Robert turned to leave, following the narrow trail that would lead him back to his cabin, he heard the soft padding of paws behind him. He glanced back. To his amazement, the bobcat was following him, limping heavily but determined, her kittens scampering behind her. "You can't come home with me," Robert said, stopping in his tracks. "You're wild. You belong here." The bobcat sat down on the trail, her injured leg extended awkwardly to the side. She made that chirping sound again, and her kittens huddled against her. The message was unmistakable. Robert Callahan, who had never kept so much as a house bed in his life, found himself faced with a decision he had never anticipated. The rational part of his mind told him to walk away. Wild animals were unpredictable, dangerous, and not meant for human interference. But something deeper, something that connected him to these woods and everything in them, wouldn't let him turn his back. "All right," he finally said, "but just until that leg heals. Then you go back where you belong." As if she understood every word, the mother bobcat rose and continued limping along the trail behind him, shepherding her kittens forward with gentle nudges and encouraging chirps. The walk home took twice as long as usual. The bobcat family followed at a distance, stopping whenever Robert looked back, advancing when he continued forward. By the time they reached the edge of the cleared area surrounding his cabin, darkness had fallen completely, and Robert used his flashlight to navigate the final stretch. At the tree line, the bobcat stopped. Robert turned to see her sitting there, her kittens pressed against her sides, her eyes reflecting the beam of his flashlight like twin moons. "The shed," Robert decided aloud. "You can stay in the tool shed until we figure this out." The small outbuilding stood about 30 yards from the main cabin, close enough to monitor but separate enough to give the wild family some privacy. Robert walked to it, unlocked the padlock, and swung the door open. Inside, garden tools hung neatly on wall pegs, and sacks of chicken feed and deer corn were stacked on shelves. A workbench ran along one wall, and several old moving blankets were folded on a bottom shelf. Robert quickly cleared a space, spread the blankets in one corner, and placed a shallow pan of water on the floor. From his pack, he took the remains of his sandwich and set the venison on one of the blankets. "It's not much," he told the darkness outside, "but it'll do for tonight." He walked back to his cabin, leaving the shed door open. From his kitchen window, he watched as the bobcat cautiously approached the shed, sniffed the entrance thoroughly, and finally limped inside. Her kittens bounded in after her, apparently less concerned with caution than their mother. Once they were settled, Robert returned to close the shed door most of the way, leaving it open just enough for the cats to leave if they chose. Then he went back to the cabin, his mind racing with plans for the morning. Inside, he called the one person who might be able to help without reporting him to Fish and Wildlife, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a veterinarian who had patched up Robert's own wounds more than once when he was too stubborn to drive to the hospital in Richmond. "You've got a what in your shed?" Sarah asked after Robert explained the situation. "A bobcat, shot in the leg. Nursing 2 kittens," Robert repeated. There was a long pause before Sarah sighed. "Robert Callahan, in the 20 years I've known you, you've never once brought home a stray dog or cat like a normal person. But a wounded bobcat? That's a new level of crazy, even for you. Will you help or not?" "Of course I'll help," Sarah said. "But you know this is technically illegal without proper wildlife rehabilitation permits." "The alternative was leaving her to die and her kittens to starve," Robert said. "Didn't seem like much of a choice." "Fair enough. I'll be there at first light. Don't try to treat her yourself. Even injured, she could take your face off." After hanging up, Robert prepared for the night with a strange sense of anticipation. As he settled into his armchair by the fire, a book of Wendell Berry poems open on his lap, he found himself listening for sounds from the shed. The rational part of his mind knew this was temporary. Wild animals belonged in the wild. But another part, perhaps the part that still carried his father's wisdom, wondered if there wasn't something more to this encounter. James Callahan had often spoken of moments when the boundary between human and animal seemed to blur, when understanding flowed between species like a current. "Pay attention to those moments, Bobby," he'd said. "They don't come often in a lifetime." Robert fell asleep in his chair, the book still open, dreaming of yellow-green eyes watching him from the shadows of the forest. Robert woke before dawn, his neck stiff from sleeping in the chair. The events of the previous day rushed back as he moved to the window, peering through the blue pre-dawn light toward the shed. The door remained as he'd left it, partially open. Whether the Bobcat family remained inside was impossible to tell from this distance. He dressed quickly, pulling on worn jeans and a flannel shirt against the morning chill, and put coffee on to brew. While it percolated, he rummaged through his freezer, finding a package of ground venison. The mother bobcat would need protein to heal and to continue producing milk for her kittens. As the eastern sky began to lighten from black to deep purple, Robert made his way cautiously to the shed, a flashlight in one hand and a bowl of thawed venison in the other. He approached slowly, making enough noise that he wouldn't startle the cats if they were still inside. "Morning," he called softly when he was a few feet from the door. "Brought you some breakfast." A low growl answered him, not aggressive, but cautious. They were still there. Robert set the bowl down just inside the door and backed away. Through the narrow opening, he could make out 3 shapes in the corner. The mother bobcat alert and watching, her kittens curled against her side, sleeping. "Sarah will be here soon," he told the bobcat. "She's good people. Patched me up more times than I can count." The bobcat blinked slowly but made no move toward the food. Robert backed further away, giving her space. Only when he was nearly to the cabin did he see her rise painfully and limp to the bowl, sniffing the meat carefully before taking a small bite. By the time Sarah's truck rumbled up the gravel driveway, the sky had lightened to a clear autumn blue, and the bowl outside the shed was empty. Sarah stepped out of her vehicle, a tall woman in her late 40s with auburn hair streaked with gray, pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore jeans, hiking boots, and a down vest over a flannel shirt not unlike Robert's own. "You look like hell, Robert," she greeted him, grabbing a large medical kit from her passenger seat. "Good morning to you too," he replied, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. Sarah had moved to Pine Hollow 15 years ago after burning out from emergency veterinary medicine in Cincinnati. She'd opened a small practice treating everything from prized hunting dogs to backyard chickens, quickly earning the respect of the community with her straightforward manner and genuine care for both animals and their people. Though never married, too busy, too particular, and too fond of my independence, she'd once told Robert, she was woven deeply into the fabric of Pine Hollow life, serving on the volunteer fire department and organizing the annual Heritage Festival. "So where's this Bobcat family of yours?" she asked, scanning the property. Robert nodded toward the shed. "In there? Mother's injured right hind leg. Gunshot, I think." Sarah's expression darkened. "Poachers? Most likely. Or someone who saw a predator and shot without thinking." They approached the shed together, moving slowly and speaking in low voices. At the door, Robert called softly, "Got someone here to help with that leg." The answering growl was immediate and more threatening than before. "She doesn't sound thrilled about visitors," Sarah observed. "Can't blame her. Humans haven't exactly been kind to her lately." Sarah set her medical kit down and crouched to peer through the partially open door. "We need her sedated to treat that wound properly. I brought a dart gun, but I'd rather not traumatize her further if we can avoid it." She reached into her kit and withdrew a syringe filled with cloudy liquid. "This is a mild sedative mixed with pain medication. If we can get her to eat something with this in it, it would be much less stressful." Robert nodded and went to the cabin, returning with another portion of ground venison. Sarah injected the medication into the meat and mixed it thoroughly. "This will take about 15 minutes to take effect," she explained as Robert placed the bowl just inside the shed door. "Let's back off and give her space." They retreated to the porch of the cabin, where Robert poured coffee into 2 mugs from his thermos. Sarah accepted hers gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. "You know we can't keep them here," she said after a long sip. "Those kittens need to grow up wild if they're going to survive." "I know," Robert agreed. "Just until she heals." Sarah studied him over the rim of her mug. "You've gone soft in your old age, Callahan." "Not soft. Just—" Robert searched for the right words. "Paying attention." After 20 minutes, they approached the shed again. The medicated meat was gone, and when they peered inside, the mother bobcat was lying on her side, still conscious but notably drowsy. The kittens, sensing something amiss with their mother, were pressed against her anxiously. "Perfect," Sarah murmured. "Drowsy but not completely under. Let's work quickly." They entered the shed, moving deliberately. The mother bobcat watched them through half-lidded eyes but didn't growl or attempt to move. "Talk to her," Sarah instructed as she opened her medical kit. "Keep her calm while I examine the wound." Robert crouched a few feet away from the bobcat's head, not close enough to be within striking distance but near enough that she could focus on him. "You're all right," he said softly. "We're going to fix that leg so you can hunt again. So you can teach these little ones everything they need to know." As he spoke, Sarah gently examined the injured leg. "You were right about the gunshot," she confirmed grimly. "Small caliber, probably a .22. The bullet went through clean, but it's fractured the tibia." For the next hour, Sarah worked methodically, cleaning the wound, administering antibiotics, setting the bone as best she could, and finally wrapping the leg in a lightweight but sturdy splint. "She needs to stay off it as much as possible for at least 3 weeks, Sarah explained as she packed up her supplies. "The splint is waterproof, but it needs to be checked and possibly replaced in 10 days. The mother bobcat remained drowsy throughout the procedure, occasionally making small sounds of discomfort but never fully rousing to aggression. The kittens had retreated to the far corner of the shed, watching with wide, wary eyes. "What about the kittens?" Robert asked. "They look healthy, from what I can see. About 8 to 10 weeks old, I'd guess. Old enough to be eating meat but still nursing some." Sarah closed her medical kit. "Keep providing food for the mother, and she'll take care of them." Before they left the shed, Sarah placed a small bowl of water within the mother's reach and administered one more injection. "Long-acting pain medication," she explained. "Should keep her comfortable for a couple of days." They exited quietly, pulling the door mostly closed behind them. Back at Sarah's truck, she handed Robert several syringes and 2 bottles of medication. "Antibiotics and pain meds. Instructions are on the bottles. You'll need to get these into her food every day." She fixed him with a stern look. "And Robert? Document everything. Photos, dates, detailed notes. If Fish and Wildlife ever comes asking questions, you need to prove this was a rescue situation, not a case of keeping wild animals as pets." Robert nodded. "I appreciate this, Sarah." "Just doing my job," she replied, but her expression softened. "It's a good thing you did, bringing them in. That wound would have killed her for sure. And then the kittens." She didn't need to finish the thought. They both knew orphaned bobcat kittens rarely survived in the wild. As Sarah's truck disappeared down the gravel drive, Robert found himself facing a new reality, temporary caretaker to a family of wild predators. It wasn't a role he had ever anticipated, but standing in his yard, looking toward the shed where the injured mother rested with her babies, he felt a strange sense of rightness settle over him. For the next week, a routine developed. Each morning and evening, Robert would bring fresh meat, venison, rabbit, or squirrel that he hunted specifically for them, mixed with the necessary medications. He would leave the food just inside the door, then retreat to watch from a distance as the mother bobcat limped forward to eat. The kittens grew bolder each day, sometimes venturing out of the shed to explore the immediate surroundings while their mother ate, always darting back inside at any unexpected sound. By the 10th day, the mother was moving more freely, putting weight on her injured leg for short periods. Robert had begun leaving the shed door fully open during daylight hours, giving the family the option to leave if they chose. They remained, though the kittens spent increasing amounts of time playing in the small cleared area around the shed while their mother watched vigilantly from the doorway. On the morning Sarah was scheduled to return to check the splint, Robert approached the shed with the usual offering of fresh meat. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. The mother bobcat was sitting just outside the shed door, her injured leg extended before her. Beside her on the ground lay a freshly killed rabbit, her offering to him. "Well, I'll be damned," Robert whispered. The bobcat watched him with those intelligent yellow-green eyes. Then, to Robert's amazement, she made a sound he had never heard from her before, a soft, rhythmic rumble, almost like a purr but more strained, broken. To his ears, attuned to the sounds of these woods for over 5 decades, it sounded remarkably like grief. Robert sank slowly to his haunches, setting his bowl of meat aside. "What is it, girl? What are you trying to tell me?" The bobcat rose painfully and limped toward her kittens, who were tumbling over each other a few yards away. She chirped sharply, and they immediately ran to her side. Then, to Robert's utter disbelief, she began herding them toward him. "What are you doing?" he asked, remaining perfectly still as the small family approached. The mother stopped about 6 feet away, her kittens pressed against her sides. She made that strange crying sound again, then nudged one of the kittens, the smaller one, toward Robert. The kitten resisted, backing away. The mother pushed again, more insistently. Finally, the little one took a few halting steps toward Robert, its spotted coat puffed up in fear, its blue-green eyes wide. Understanding dawned slowly, painfully. The mother bobcat was bringing her kitten to him. She was giving it to him? Robert looked more closely at the smaller kitten. Now that it was nearer, he could see what he had missed before, the labored breathing, the slightly dulled coat, the too thin frame despite regular feeding. This kitten was sick. As if to confirm his realization, the mother bobcat made that crying sound again and nudged her kitten the rest of the way to Robert's feet. Then she backed away, returning to her stronger kitten's side. "She wants me to help it," Robert said aloud, amazement coloring his voice. The sick kitten crouched at his feet, trembling violently, caught between fear of the human and obedience to its mother. Slowly, moving with infinite care, Robert reached down and lifted the small creature. It weighed almost nothing in his weathered hands, its tiny heart racing wildly against his palms. The mother watched, making no move to interfere. Her eyes never left Robert's face. "I'll do what I can," he promised her. "I'll do everything I can." When Sarah arrived an hour later, she found Robert sitting on his porch, the sick bobcat kitten wrapped in a soft towel and cradled in his lap. The mother and the healthy kitten watched from the relative safety of the shed doorway. Sarah assessed the situation with one sweeping glance. "Tell me," she said simply. Robert explained what had happened, still barely believing it himself. Sarah listened without interruption, her expression shifting from skepticism to wonder. In 30 years of veterinary medicine, I've never heard of anything like it, she admitted when he finished. A wild bobcat deliberately giving her sick kitten to a human for care? It defies everything we know about wild animal behavior. Unless, Robert said quietly, she's not acting on instinct but on understanding. Sarah didn't dismiss the idea outright. After examining the sick kitten, diagnosing a severe respiratory infection complicated by what appeared to be a congenital heart defect, she sat beside Robert on the porch steps. The science of animal cognition is still in its infancy, she said, watching the mother bobcat watching them. We're constantly discovering new depths to animal intelligence, emotion, and decision-making. What you're describing, a mother making a conscious choice to entrust her offspring to another species for its survival, it's extraordinary. But not, perhaps, impossible. The sick kitten required intensive care. Sarah administered antibiotics and showed Robert how to feed it a special formula using a syringe. The prognosis wasn't good. Bobcat kittens with congenital heart defects rarely survive to adulthood, even with the best veterinary care. We'll do what we can for as long as we can, Sarah told him. That's all anyone can do. As she was preparing to leave, having also checked and re-bandaged the mother's leg, Sarah paused by her truck. Robert, she said hesitantly, have you considered what happens next? Even if the sick kitten survives, it may never be strong enough for release. And the others, once the mother heals, they go back to the wild, Robert said firmly, where they belong. And if Fish and Wildlife finds out. Robert gazed toward the shed, where the mother bobcat had settled on the blankets, her healthy kitten nursing contentedly. Then I'll deal with it. But I won't betray her trust. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of worry and hope. Robert moved the sick kitten into the cabin, setting up a makeshift nest in a box near the wood stove. Every few hours, day and night, he administered medication and formula. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, he would talk to the tiny creature as it struggled for breath in his palms. Your mama knew what she was doing, bringing you to me, he would say softly. Smartest bobcat in these hills, your mama. To Robert's growing wonder, each morning when he took the sick kitten outside for brief periods of fresh air, the mother bobcat would approach, cautiously at first, then with increasing boldness. She would sniff her kitten thoroughly, occasionally grooming it with a rough tongue, then look up at Robert with what he could only interpret as gratitude before returning to her healthy kitten waiting by the shed. Despite Robert and Sarah's best efforts, the sick kitten's condition worsened. Its breathing became more labored, its periods of alertness shorter. On the 17th day after the mother had entrusted it to Robert's care, the little one died peacefully in his hands as the first light of dawn filtered through the cabin windows. Robert sat motionless for a long time, the tiny body cooling in his palms, tears tracking silently down his weathered cheeks. He had known this was the likely outcome, but the reality of it, the extinguishing of that small, fierce life, hit him with unexpected force. When he finally rose, he wrapped the kitten in a soft flannel shirt that had belonged to his father and carried it outside. The mother bobcat was waiting, as if she already knew. Her healthy kitten played nearby, oblivious to the gravity of the moment. Robert knelt and carefully placed the wrapped bundle on the ground before her. The mother bobcat approached, sniffed the bundle thoroughly, then made a low, keening sound that raised the hair on the back of Robert's neck. She knew. I'm sorry, Robert whispered. I tried. The mother bobcat looked at him for a long moment, her yellow-green eyes holding his. Then, to Robert's astonishment, she bumped her head gently against his outstretched hand, the first time she had initiated physical contact, before picking up the wrapped kitten in her mouth and carrying it to the edge of the forest. Her remaining kitten, sensing the solemnity of the moment, followed quietly behind. At the tree line, the mother bobcat turned back once to look at Robert, the bundle still held carefully in her jaws. Then she disappeared into the underbrush, her surviving kitten at her heels. Robert didn't see them for 3 days. The shed remained empty, the food he left untouched. He began to think they had returned to the wild for good, that the death of the kitten had severed whatever extraordinary bond had formed between them. Then, on the morning of the 4th day, he opened his cabin door to find the mother and her remaining kitten sitting on his porch. The mother's splinted leg was extended awkwardly to the side, but she was putting more weight on it than before. The kitten had grown noticeably in just a few days, its movements more coordinated, its spotted coat thicker. "Welcome back," Robert said softly, sinking down to sit cross-legged on the porch. The mother bobcat approached him with a new confidence, no longer limping as severely. She sniffed his hands thoroughly, perhaps searching for the scent of her lost kitten, then settled beside him on the porch, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her wild body through his jeans. The surviving kitten remained more cautious, watching from a few feet away with alert, curious eyes. They stayed that way for nearly an hour, man and bobcat sitting side by side in the morning sunshine, connected by an understanding that transcended species. When they finally rose, the mother led her surviving kitten back to the shed, where they would remain for another 2 weeks until Sarah declared the leg healed enough for return to the wild. The day of release came in late November, when the hills had turned to shades of umber and gray, the trees bare-fingered against the pale sky. Robert had been preparing himself for weeks, reminding himself that wild animals belonged in the wild, that keeping them would be not just illegal, but a betrayal of their true nature. Still, as he and Sarah stood at the edge of Miller's clearing, the same place where he had first encountered the injured mother, Robert felt a hollow ache spreading beneath his ribs. "You've done a good thing, Robert," Sarah said, sensing his melancholy. "She's healed. The kitten is strong. They have their best chance now." The bobcats traveled to the release site in separate carriers in the back of Robert's truck. Now, as he set the carriers on the ground and opened their doors, he found himself holding his breath. The kitten bolted first, a streak of spotted fur disappearing into the underbrush at the edge of the clearing. The mother emerged more slowly, stepping cautiously into the familiar territory. The splint was gone now, replaced by a clean white scar visible through the fur of her right hind leg. She walked with only the slightest hint of a limp, her muscles strong from weeks of increasingly longer supervised excursions around Robert's property. She paused a few feet from the carriers, looking back at Robert. Her yellow-green eyes held his for a long moment. "Go on," he told her softly. "This is where you belong." As if understanding his words, she turned and trotted to the edge of the clearing where her kitten waited. With one last glance back at the humans, she led her offspring into the depths of the forest, disappearing as completely as if they had never existed outside the wild. "That's that," Sarah said, laying a hand briefly on Robert's shoulder. Robert nodded, not trusting himself to speak. As they packed the empty carriers back into his truck, he felt both hollowed out and somehow filled. Emptied of the daily presence of the bobcats, but filled with the knowledge of what had transpired between them. Winter settled over Pine Hollow with a crystalline ferocity. Snow piled in drifts against Robert's cabin walls, and the forest fell silent under the weight of white. He continued his routines, splitting wood for the stove, guiding the occasional winter hunt, repairing furniture in his workshop for folks in town. But each time he walked past the empty shed, each time he found himself pausing to listen for the chirp of bobcats that were no longer there, he felt the peculiar emptiness that comes from touching something wild and then letting it go. "You're brooding," Sarah told him bluntly during one of her visits in January. She'd stopped by with a venison stew and news from town, a kindness she'd been extending more frequently since the bobcat's departure. "Just thinking," Robert countered, stoking the fire in the wood stove. "About the bobcats." It wasn't a question. Robert nodded. "Wonder how they're doing out there. If the leg's holding up. If the kitten's learning to hunt properly." Sarah studied him over her steaming mug. "You gave them back their chance, Robert. That's all any of us can do for wild things." The truth of her words didn't make the wondering any easier. As winter stretched into spring, Robert found himself watching for signs during his forest excursions. Bobcat tracks in the mud, scat on fallen logs, snagged on brambles. Occasionally, he would find evidence of their presence in the larger forest ecosystem, but never any confirmation that it was his bobcats. He reminded himself that thinking of them as his was precisely the problem. They had never been his. They had been their own, always, even when taking shelter in his shed and accepting food from his hands. Spring unfurled across the Appalachian foothills, painting the forest in delicate greens and riotous wildflower blooms. Robert spent more time in the woods as the weather warmed, partly following his usual seasonal patterns of foraging for ramps and morels, partly hoping for a glimpse of tawny spotted fur among the new growth. It was late May when Tyler Hargrove stopped by the cabin, his mud-spattered pickup grinding to a halt in Robert's gravel drive. Tyler was perhaps 40, a third-generation logger who had transitioned to sustainable forestry practices after a bitter fight with his father over clear-cutting. He wasn't exactly a friend. Robert didn't collect many of those, but they shared a respect for the forest that transcended their different ways of making a living from it. "Callahan," Tyler greeted him, climbing down from the truck cab. "Got something you might want to know about." Robert set aside the turkey call he'd been carving and stood from his porch chair. "What's that?" "Poachers," Tyler said grimly. "Working the north ridge above Stiller Creek. Found a bait pile and a blind yesterday when I was marking trees for selective cutting." Robert's jaw tightened. "Game wardens know? Called it in, but they're stretched thin. Said they'd try to get someone out next week." Tyler spat into the gravel. "By then, who knows what they'll have killed?" Tyler's news settled like a stone in Robert's gut. The North Ridge was prime habitat for deer, black bear, and smaller predators, including bobcats. The thought of poachers operating in what might be his bobcat's territory filled him with a cold fury. "Whereabouts exactly?" Robert asked. Tyler gave him detailed directions to the bait pile and blind. "Figured you spend enough time in those woods that you might keep an eye out. Maybe find something the wardens can use when they finally get around to it." After Tyler left, Robert stood on his porch, looking toward the North Ridge visible through the trees. The responsible thing would be to wait for the game wardens. Let the professionals handle it. Stay out of it. He was checking his rifle an hour later, packing a small kit with a camera, water, and provisions for an overnight stay if necessary. The spring day was warming rapidly, promising the first truly hot day of the season. Robert dressed in light layers, pulled on his most silent hiking boots, and headed toward the North Ridge. The hike took most of the afternoon. Robert moved carefully, stopping often to listen and observe, leaving minimal sign of his passage. The forest was alive with spring energy, birds calling territorial warnings and mating invitations, squirrels chattering, insects humming in the dappled sunlight. None of the nervous silence that would indicate larger predators, human or animal, actively hunting nearby. He found the bait pile exactly where Tyler had described it, in a small natural clearing surrounded by dense rhododendron thickets. The pile itself was revolting, rotting meat, fish entrails, and what looked disturbingly like domestic dog food, all designed to attract bears and other predators. The blind was well constructed, with shooting ports positioned for clear shots at anything approaching the bait. Robert photographed everything methodically, documenting the setup from multiple angles. As he was about to check for shell casings or other evidence the wardens might find useful, a sound froze him in place. The distinctive growl of a rattlesnake, close enough to raise the hair on his arms. Moving with extreme caution, Robert turned his head to locate the source. The timber rattler was coiled less than 6 feet away, its massive body tensed, head raised, rattles buzzing a warning that needed no translation. It was an enormous specimen, probably 15 years old judging by its size and coloration, and directly between Robert and his rifle, which he had propped against a tree while taking photographs. Robert assessed his options with the clarity that comes from imminent danger. The snake was too close for him to reach his weapon safely. His hunting knife would require getting dangerously near those fangs. Running might trigger a strike. He began to back away slowly, maintaining eye contact with the rattler. One careful step, then another. The snake continued rattling but didn't strike. Robert allowed himself to think he might make it to safer distance. Then his boot heel caught on an exposed root, throwing him off balance. As he staggered slightly, the rattler launched forward with explosive speed. Robert tried to twist away, but knew he wouldn't be fast enough. The snake's head was a blur of motion, fangs extended. A tawny shape erupted from the rhododendron thicket, moving so quickly it registered only as a streak in Robert's peripheral vision. Then another. The leading form collided with the striking snake in midair, powerful jaws clamping around the rattler's neck just behind its wedge-shaped head. A bobcat. And not just any bobcat. A female with a distinctive white scar visible on her right hind leg. The snake writhed violently, its muscular body whipping in desperate coils, but the bobcat held firm, shaking the reptile with swift, powerful jerks. A second bobcat, larger, younger, circled and darted in to deliver slashing attacks with razor-sharp claws whenever the snake's coils came within range. The battle was brief but savage. Within moments, the rattlesnake went limp in the mother bobcat's jaws. She dropped it to the forest floor and backed away, watching it warily for any sign of continued threat. Finding none, she turned her yellow-green eyes to Robert, who had remained frozen in disbelief throughout the encounter. "My God," he whispered. The mother bobcat sat on her haunches about 10 feet from him, her chest heaving slightly from exertion, but otherwise showing no sign of distress. The younger bobcat, her surviving kitten, now nearly adult size, maintained a more cautious distance, watching the interaction with alert curiosity. Robert slowly, carefully straightened from his defensive crouch. The bobcats made no move to run. "You saved my life," he told the mother quietly. She blinked slowly, her ears forward and attentive. Then she did something that would remain burned in Robert's memory for the rest of his days. She chirped, the same distinctive sound she had used to call her kittens, and inclined her head slightly toward the bait pile and blind. The message couldn't have been clearer if she'd spoken English. "This place is dangerous." "I know," Robert said. "Poachers. I'm trying to stop them." The mother bobcat held his gaze for another long moment. Then she rose, shook herself once, and turned toward her offspring. With a flick of her tail, she led the younger bobcat back into the rhododendron thicket. At the edge of the undergrowth, she paused to look back at Robert one final time before disappearing into the shadows of the forest that was her true home. Robert stood motionless for several minutes, absorbing what had just happened. The bobcats, his bobcats, had saved him from a potentially fatal snake bite. They had recognized him. They had intervened. And then, message delivered, they had returned to their wild lives. He collected his rifle and the evidence he had gathered, giving the dead rattlesnake a wide berth. As he hiked back toward his cabin in the gathering dusk, his mind replayed the encounter over and over. The scientific part of his brain searched for rational explanations, territorial defense, coincidence, the natural predatory instinct of bobcats toward snakes. But his heart knew better. The mother bobcat had repaid a debt that existed only in the mysterious accounting of wild things. Life for life, trust for trust, care for care. When he reached home, the first stars pricking through the darkening sky, Robert called both Sarah and the game warden's office. The evidence he had gathered, combined with continued surveillance over the next week, eventually led to the arrest of 3 men from out of state who had been illegally hunting black bears and selling gallbladders and paws on the black market. In the months and years that followed, Robert occasionally glimpsed the bobcats at a distance during his forest excursions, a flash of spotted fur, the silhouette of tufted ears against the sunset, tracks in fresh snow that he recognized as belonging to the distinctive gait of the mother with her slightly altered stride from the old injury. He never approached them, never called to them, never left food to draw them in. They were wild, and he honored that wildness by allowing them their freedom and distance. But each sighting, however brief, filled him with a quiet joy and a profound sense of connection to something larger than himself. By the time Robert reached his 60s, his bobcat sightings had grown less frequent. The mother would be aging now, perhaps gone altogether, returned to the earth that had sustained her. The offspring might have dispersed to new territories, carrying some small memory of human kindness in their wild DNA. On a crisp autumn afternoon, much like the one when he had first encountered the injured mother years before, Robert rested on his favorite fallen oak in Miller's clearing. His joints ached more these days, his steps had slowed, but he still found peace in these woods that had shaped his entire life. Movement at the clearing's edge caught his eye. A female bobcat, smaller than the one he had rescued, but with the same distinctive spotted pattern, leading two tiny kittens through the ferns. She paused when she saw him, her head tilted in what looked remarkably like recognition. Robert sat perfectly still, barely breathing. The female bobcat made no move to flee. Instead, she settled onto her haunches at the edge of the clearing, allowing her kittens to tumble and play in the dappled sunlight while she watched both them and the man with alert, yellow-green eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of generations. "Hello, little one," Robert said softly. "You look just like your grandmother." The bobcat blinked slowly, a gesture that felt like acknowledgement across the divide of species. Then she gathered her kittens with a chirping call that echoed through the clearing, leading them onward into the heart of the forest that belonged to them all. Robert remained on his log long after they had gone, his weathered face creased in a smile. In a world that so often drew hard lines between wild and tame, human and animal, he had been granted a rare glimpse of the truth that lay beneath such artificial divisions, that all living things were connected in ways both mysterious and profound, and that sometimes, just sometimes, those connections transcended every boundary to touch the deepest parts of what it meant to be alive on this shared earth. And in that understanding, Robert Callahan found a peace as vast and enduring as the ancient forest itself.